I am reading chapter 6 of Some Kind of Courage with permission from Scholastic. Chapter 6. My heart dropped to my feet. Aki, what in the ever-loving world do you think you're... I hissed, but stopped, not wanting to alert the grizzly that Aki was on the ground with her, just on the other side of the boulder. But there weren't no need for my caution. Aki didn't scurry off or try and hide or any such thing. Aki, arms at his sides and just as calm as you please, walked right around the boulder toward where this mama grizzly stood with her bloody claws and ready teeth and unshot eye, wanting to eat me. And as he walked, he was talking. Nice and easy, low and calm, Aki was talking to that bear in Chinese. When he rounded the corner, the bear's head snapped over to look at him. I think she was surprised as I was. She dropped to all fours and took a fast, angry step toward him, a growl hard and hungry in her throat, where I guessed the sizable chunk of Aki would soon be. But Aki just stopped where he was and kept on talking, his voice mellow like a crackling campfire, like a river telling stories. And that grizzly stopped too, a few feet away from him, almost eye to eye with him, close enough no doubt to strike with those claws and bring his blood out. I stood on top of that boulder, looking down on a mama grizzly and a Chinese orphan, a cocked pistol frozen in my hand. The bear roared, a full and meaty roar with plenty of fierceness and fury in it, but the roar seemed to end in a kind of a question mark, and she stood where she was, and Aki kept talking. Then, as he talked, Aki reached with one hand into his shirt and pulled something out. I squinted to see. It was the carving, that little black bird. He held that stone bird out to the grizzly and told her all about it. And she stood there listening, sniffing at the wind and looking at the plumb crazy boy in front of her. I don't know if I breathed or swallowed for 2 whole minutes or for however long it took for Aki to tell his story to that angry mama grizzly. But then he was done. He bowed to her, stiff and quick, and then walked around the road a bit, away from her babies. He climbed a few steps up the bank on the side of the road and sat down, then put his hands on his knees and looked at the bear. I doubt whether anyone had ever stood before that big old grizzly and talked to her, but I sure reckon no one ever stood in front of her and talked to her in Chinese. I don't know what that bear was thinking or what she was feeling, but she stood there looking at Aki for a minute. Then she looked back up at me on the boulder, standing there stupidly and still pointing a gun at her. Then she grunted and growled kind of to herself, and she walked down the road and back to her waiting cubs. They scampered forward to meet her, and together the 3 of them walked into the trees. I stood there for a second, catching my breath and collecting my wits. Then I finally lowered the gun and uncocked the hammer. I looked over at Aki. He looked up at me, his face expressionless. That was the dumbest thing I ever seen somebody do, I said in wonder. And it was the bravest, too. A Chinese boy, thousands of miles from home, talking face to face with a mama grizzly to keep her cubs from becoming orphans. I think my mama would have liked you, Aki, I said. He said a few words back to me in Chinese. I cocked my head at him. He smiled, the biggest smile I'd seen crack his face, and pointed up at me, but a bit lower than my face. I looked down. In all the excitement, I'd lost track of my britches. They'd fallen down again around my ankles. My drawers, too. I was standing there on the top of a rock for all the world to see, with a pistol in my hand, naked as the day I was born from the waist down. A cool draft blew through my legs. I heard Aki laugh for the first time as my face turned redder than a turkey's waddle, and I rushed to yank up my pants. We camped that night just over the top of Clocken Pass. It was a fine feeling when we got to the top of her last uphill climb and saw the road leading down in front of us, rolling around bends into the great spread-out valley below us. There were a lot more trees on this side of the mountains, and I could only see the road here and there through the timber until it disappeared. Somewhere down there was the town of Ellensburg, where I hoped Ezra Bishop was going to hold up for a while so I could catch him. I scanned the forested hills below hungrily, hoping just maybe to see in the distance a man on a horse leading a string of ponies that included a beautiful red and white paint with a notched ear. Everything was still, though, and quiet, and the whole landscape was falling into shadow as the sun got ready to set. My Sarah was nowhere to be seen. Part of me wanted to call, to holler her name with all the air in my lungs and let it echo down to wherever she was. I just knew that if she heard me call, she'd break any rope and brave any whip to get to me. But I knew it was no use. I sighed. At least I didn't see any grizzlies. I turned to Aki as he stepped up to where I was. "That's it," I said, sweeping my arm at the view before us. "No more up." He leaned down with his hands on his knees to catch his breath and nodded. I think he understood. A wind was starting to blow, and it was sure enough cold, pushing right through the threads of my clothes and bringing goose flesh out all over my body. We found a spot between two boulders for camp. There weren't much talking this time, but right from the start we sat up against each other, both happy for the warmth of each other. The grizzly had left 4 deep raw cuts in my leg that throbbed with constant pain. I washed my leg off as best I could with water from our canteen, but I didn't have no bandages or even cloth to wrap it with. I had to just hope I wouldn't get no infection. In the morning, Aki shook me awake. I'd been lost in an uneasy dream that was half memory, with the biting sound of a shovel and the smell of fresh dirt, and Papa standing with his arm around me, his body shaken with quiet sobs. It took me a confused moment to realize it was Aki shaking me and not Papa, but I was glad to let the sad cloud of that dream get blown out of my mind by the morning chill. His voice was half whisper, half shout, and sounded more excited than scared. I blinked my eyes and looked around to see what he was all agitated about. Snow. All around us, covering the rocks and the trees and the brush. Not a lot, but enough to know it was snow and not just a heavy frost. It was even on our shoulders and knees. I brushed it off and couldn't help but let a smile onto my face. I was shivering something fierce, but I'd always loved snow. It was still falling, but barely, just little flakes here and there dancing lightly down to the ground. "Angel feathers," I said quietly, watching it fall. Aki looked at me. "That's what my sister called it, Katie." Saying her name out loud like that, after so long, made me want to smile and cry at the same time. It made me feel a whole different kind of alone. When there was snow like this in the morning, I used to say it looked like sugar, like the whole world had gotten candied overnight. But she insisted it was feathers from the wings of angels flying around at night watching over people. Aki sat there and listened with his solemn eyes. I blew my breath out in a foggy cloud. "Let's stoke the fire and eat some grub and hit the road." Getting down a mountain was sure enough easier than going up one, and we made good time all morning, barely slowing down to eat our lunch when the sun was straight overhead and our bellies were growling. It was the last food from my satchel, giving me one more reason to want to get to Ellensburg as fast as we could. We were rounding a bend through an especially thick part of the forest when I stopped short and held out an arm to stop Aki. I'd heard something out in the trees away from the road, but I wasn't sure what. I prayed that it weren't another grizzly looking for one last meal before bedding down for the winter. At least I had my pants on this time. I heard it again, and Aki did too. We both tilted our heads in the same direction. The trees were so thick and close together that the road was almost dark. There it was again, and now I was sure it was a voice. It sounded about 50 feet off the trail, out of sight through the underbrush. There were a few more low words, and I realized it was a boy's voice, and he sounded like he was in distress. I noticed something else, too. I was pretty sure he weren't speaking English, and that he weren't speaking Chinese either. I walked off the road a few feet, keeping my ears sharp and my feet quiet. I could feel Aki following behind. A calm in the breeze brought the tree rustling to a quiet, and I heard a whole sentence clear as day. It was definitely a boy's voice, and he sounded hurt. I hesitated. Walking into what could be danger ain't never the smartest idea, and I had a horse to catch. But I knew Mama and Papa would never abide walking by when another soul needed help. Then I heard another voice. It was a girl's, and younger. She sounded little, and she sounded afraid. I didn't wait, but charged straight off through the woods toward the voices. I pushed through brush and ducked under branches and then came out into a little clear spot. As I broke through the last branches, the voices stopped. I stumbled to a halt. As Aki crashed up behind me, my eyes took in the scene before me. It was Indians. 2 of them. A boy, older and taller than me, his bare arms taut with muscles, and a girl, 5 or 6 years old, with her arms around him and a terrified look on her face. The boy's eyes narrowed. He bared his teeth like a wolf and snarled a word low and mean in his native tongue. A shaft of sunlight through the treetops gleamed on the long knife blade held in his hand as he ducked into a crouch and lunged toward me.